In North Africa, American tank and anti-tank units clashing with Nazi armor.
1942 marked the United States' first year of fighting in the Second World War, and quickly over 50,000 Axis prisoners of war needed food, clothing, and a place to be housed. To accommodate the growing number of captured and surrendered enemy troops, over 500 prisoner of war or POW camps were established across the U.S. In keeping with guidelines that no camp should be near a U.S. coastline, U.S. border, or in an area of large population, 687 acres of land near the farming and ranching town of Douglas, Wyoming was picked. Before prisoners arrived, Camp Douglas was open to the general public for a tour. Over 2,000 people from all over eastern Wyoming visited the newly formed camp that was built in just under 4 months. They marveled that it was like a small city with everything from its own power system and infirmary to a firehouse and ball fields. Regardless of any reservations the locals might have held about a population of enemy combatants only 2 fences away from their homes and families, many Douglasites saw the coming of the camp as an economic boom for the community and a chance to show their patriotism.
Douglas Enterprise, 17th August 1943. The first group of prisoners from the Douglas Prison of War Camp, numbering 412 Italians, arrived here Friday afternoon on a special Northwestern passenger train. Closely guarded, the prisoners were taken from the train and formed into companies of approximately 50, and from there were marched to the camp. Although tired and bedraggled from their long ride from New York City, where they were boarded after their voyage from Tunisia, the prisoners seemed happy to have reached their destination. Of the 412 internees, 10 were immediately hospitalized, some suffering from wounds and others from several different maladies. The prisoners as a whole looked well cared for and showed no signs of undernourishment. According to the officers at the camp, the Italians, averaging about 26 years of age, are a well-trained group. Their morale is extremely high. Their surprise and apparent delight in finding such a place to be interned was readily seen by those at the camp, and the psychological effect upon the injured and weak with sheets and soft mattresses was amazing.
Newspapers cited that Douglas locals were so curious about their new neighbors that traffic was tied up as much of the town had come to the train stop to get a look. The site would eventually house over 1,900 Italian prisoners from 1943 to 1944. When Italy surrendered, the Italian captives were sent away, and between 1944 and 1946, over 3,000 German POWs were interned at the camp.
The rules agreed upon at Geneva covering the treatment of prisoners of war are read from Field Manual 27-10 in a language they can understand.
Kriegsgefangene sind verpflichtet, nur ihren Namen, Rang.
After entering through the gate of Camp Douglas for the first time, prisoners were given a medical examination. Usually, a handful of prisoners were admitted to the hospital while the rest continued on with the process of receiving their prisoner of war fatigues and barracks assignments. At 6 in the morning, the prisoners of Camp Douglas woke, and by 6:20 stood in formation for reveille. By 6:50, they reported for breakfast. Prisoners received 3 meals a day, and mess receipts from the Times show everything from chicken and salami to eggs and bacon.
National preferences and tastes are taken into account in planning the meals for the prisoners. These menus covering meals for a month are prepared in the office of the Quartermaster General. For instance, the Italians at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, asked for more bread and spaghetti instead of their meat allowance. The camp now gets more flour and less meat. The menus for a typical day at camp consist of spaghetti, pork, potatoes, coleslaw, canned pears, coffee, and thick crusted Italian bread. It is mentioned that the men leave their plates clean.
POW officers and NCOs remained in charge of their soldiers, but took ultimate orders from the American service members in charge of the camps.
The prisoners have radios donated by welfare agencies and receive newspapers. Soccer is the favorite sport. Intercompany games are scheduled Sunday afternoons by the Special Services Officer. They're allowed to take hikes around the countryside accompanied by guards, visit one another in different compounds, and American relatives can visit them at the stockade.
Residents of the camp often made artwork to sell or give as gifts that are still found in many homes in Douglas. Some POWs even made glue for their projects using dried cottage cheese mixed with water.
They were always on the lookout for an old cedar fence post or an apple crate or a piece of wire or almost anything. They turn out beautiful things, even clocks and violins. Many of them were real artisans.
What was the Officers Club still houses one of the lasting art projects completed by Italian POWs. Murals depicting saloon shootouts and other Western themes still adorn the walls there. It remains unknown why these themes were picked. However, many of the paintings are apparent copies of works done by famous Western artists such as Charlie Russell. The Italian prisoners had their own newspaper, La Voce d'Italia, or The Voice of Italy. While the newspaper published by the later arriving Germans, the Echard, was banned by camp officials after only 2 issues as it was seen as rabid Nazi propaganda. Eventually, it was replaced by a more moderate periodical, the Douglas Open Word.
Military government, American style.
One element of camp life was trying to convert captives to the American system of democracy. In one experiment, each barrack represented a fictional county, each compound a state, and the entire camp represented a fictional country. The inmates then elected a president of their country. All went well until the German president of the camp became something of a dictator in his own right and was promptly impeached.
Lyle Dedmore, former Douglas boy, visited Douglas Saturday. He moved about on crutches, having lost his right foot on the battlefront in Germany. Lyle, a good-looking young man, attended school in Douglas. He was on the front lines in Germany, advancing against the enemies when he stepped on a landmine. Shrapnel peppered his hands, left leg, and mangled his right foot so severely that amputation was necessary a few inches above the ankle. He arrived in the States from overseas on Friday, April 13th.
One of the remarkable things about Camp Douglas was the way prisoners were treated, even though they were from countries that were inflicting casualties on the sons of people living just across the Platte River in town.
While it is true that prisoners are enemies of this country, and many have been directly responsible for the loss of American lives, they cannot be treated entirely as enemies, but must be treated as soldiers rather than as criminals. Always with this thought in the background, the treatment we accord enemy captives will, in some measure at least, determine the kind of treatment given to American soldiers who have been unfortunate enough to fall into enemy hands. There are at least 2 other reasons for the good treatment of prisoners. One, based upon a treaty made at Geneva on July 27, 1929, and the other a purely psychological one, namely that war-weary and underfed troops may be tempted to lay down their arms to an enemy who feeds them generously and gives them safe haven.
The Geneva Convention forbade physically punishing prisoners. Most consequences of rule breaking resulted in revoking privileges or confining offenders to the guardhouse. Problems in the compound were relatively rare. Most of the trouble was caused by fanatical members of the SS who would attack other German prisoners whom they saw as too cooperative with the Americans. These men were quickly isolated from the general population of prisoners.
POWs used dummies to effect escape. 3 German prisoners of war are missing from the local camp, according to the sheriff's office. The correct number of prisoners were in line at the camp Sunday morning when the men answered roll call. Guards, however, decided to investigate the situation when they noticed that some of the men looked a little strange. The investigation revealed that 3 of the prisoners were dummies being supported by the Germans.
The escape attempts from Camp Douglas were relatively rare, and all escapees were caught before leaving the state.
Local officers take escaped Nazi POWs. The 3 German prisoners who escaped from the Douglas camp last week were captured last Thursday afternoon along the banks of the Platte River near the Fritz Schneider place. Sheriff Ivester said the Germans were resting and had planned to travel that night when they would not be seen.
With a vast amount of the local workforce gone to support the war effort, farms, ranches, and the lumber industry could apply to have POWs work for them. County Agent W.S. Howard of Douglas even claimed that prisoner laborers saved local crops in 1943. The work was voluntary, and prisoners received as much as $4 a day depending on their labor. F.W. Bartling of Douglas commented on prisoners in the lumber crews.
6 military guards were sent into Estabrook with our timber crew, but they seldom went into the timber with the prisoners. The men seemed to appreciate the privilege of spending time in the mountains and made no attempt to escape.
Some of the prisoners' earnings were in the form of script for use in the PX, where candy bars and even beer could be purchased. However, much of it was put into savings accounts for the laborers to use later. Some went home after the war with as much as $500 in their accounts. Many times the line between guards, prisoners, and the civilians of Douglas became very blurred. Caesar Oriano, an Italian POW, would invite the Catholic chaplain of Italian descent to come eat with the prisoners whenever homemade ravioli or other Italian food was made, though a disgruntled American captain soon made the practice stop. Many Douglasites also grew close with the soldiers working at the prison.
Lieutenant Joseph Zyklowski, hospital dentist, presented Miss Betty Beckworth, an employee at Casper, with an engagement ring during the New Year's Eve party in the Officers Club. No date has been set for the wedding. Funeral services were held in the stockade at the prisoner of war camp yesterday morning for Captain Giacomo Greco, Italian war prisoner who died last Monday at Fitzsimmons Hospital in Denver, where he had been taken for special treatment. Captain Greco, the first prisoner at the camp who has died since its establishment, was buried in the camp cemetery.
Less than 10 people ever died at Camp Douglas. In addition to Captain Greco, there was an aged German Red Cross worker who refused to leave the German POWs at the camp, though he could have under the Geneva Convention. Also among the deceased was a 14-year-old German soldier who died from a gangrenous battle wound he was still suffering from when he arrived at the camp. The only POW who was killed while trying to escape was also buried near the site. All remains were repatriated at the close of the war. In 1946, the last group of POWs left the gates of Camp Douglas for the last time to return to a now war-ravaged Europe. Many returned to their countries to find their homes and businesses destroyed. For many, the camp with its hot meals and predictable routines were sorely missed. Some POWs interned in Wyoming returned after the war to visit or to live. Otto Recknagel was sponsored by former Army Sergeant Martez Uzaki to work in his hardware store. Julius Algermission was sponsored by the Cross family and later worked at the University of Wyoming. One POW is quoted as having said, "I never felt like a free man until I was a prisoner in your country."